I think possibly for the first time on stage together, Jhumpa, Lahiri and Kiran Desai. In conversation with them, Anindita Ghose, a writer, journalist, and communications consultant, whose first novel was The Illuminated, and who has recently edited the anthology, The Only City. May I now please request Jhumpa, Kiran, and Anindita to come on stage, and over to you, Anindita.
Hello, Kolkata. I'm not surprised by how packed this session is. When Malvika said this was one of the highlight sessions, she meant business. It's a privilege to be here with two writers that I admire very much, and I'm going to try not to fangirl and allow them to speak more. Welcome, Jhumpa and Kiran. I believe you've never been on a stage together before, so this is a real treat for the audience here. Jhumpa, I'll start with you. We are on day 5 of the Kolkata Lit Meet. You spoke on day 1 and 2. We had spoken about a decade ago for an interview for Vogue when you spoke about your early memories of coming to Kolkata and the visits to College Street and the long afternoons in the family home. I want to ask what's changed for you, from the visits as a young girl to now visiting as a celebrated writer. How has Kolkata changed in your eyes?
Thank you. Well, good evening to everybody, and thank you for coming, and thanks again to the festival for treating us all so well. Really enjoying the time I've been here, and thrilled to be in conversation with Kiran in an official way, in a very public way. Yeah, so what's changed? Well, the city has, of course, changed quite dramatically since my childhood memories of sort of the 70s and 80s. I think the most significant thing that's changed is that the people, the influences I had as a young girl, mainly from my mamar bari, my mother's side, in North Kolkata. My grandfather, who was a painter, who knew Satyajit Ray. My older uncle, my Boro Mama, who was a copy editor and a huge reader. And he would send us lists of books to bring to him, Somerset Maugham and all of his favorite authors, and we would bring him, and he would lock them into his cupboards, with a little padlock, and treasured these books. And he was the one who would take my mother to College Street. I mean, he was an enormous influence on me as a child, as sort of what it meant to revere literature, love books, read, write. Another one of my uncles was an artist, a visual artist, a photographer, a painter. There was music playing in their house all the time, talk of films, arguments about who was the best director. This atmosphere was so important, so influential on me. And even though they were talking about, maybe poets and that I wasn't even reading or understanding, it was the passion with which they spoke about art, about literature, that impacted me at that young age. And so the big difference is they're all gone, right? The big difference is that they've gone, and I'm now as old or older than my memories of them, right? So that's the most profound difference, of sort of moving through time and remembering them, and remembering what they taught me.
Thank you for sharing that. You do have a few relatives in the audience.
I do,
as well.
I do.
Kiran, I'm going to broaden the question for you a bit. You've been on a breakneck tour of, the different book festivals in India. And it's still some more weeks to go, I believe. How has it been for you to meet readers here, to meet audiences here, who are in some ways represented in your writing? How different is it than, say, going to the book festivals in Europe or US?
Well, again, like Jhumpa, it's so lovely to be on stage with you, and you too, Anindita. And the last time I was here was with my mother at this book festival some 8 years ago, being interviewed by Sandeep Roy. So it's just lovely to be back. But, just echo a bit of what Jhumpa was saying. When I was here with my mom, I saw her Bengali side come out. She's half Bengali, she's a Mazumdar. And I think she received that depth of, her artistic side also was really fueled by her Bengali father, and she had a German mother. But she talks a lot about that bookshelf of her childhood and the songs her father used to sing. Was it called The Boatman on the Volga? I'm maybe getting it wrong. But remembers going with her father to see Satyajit Ray's films, Pathar Panchali. And she said her father took her, and when she came out, she saw her father's cheeks were, sheathed in tears, because it was his Bengal. And he actually came from Dhaka. And it was his childhood. And I remember going with my mother to see Satyajit Ray in New York. And I remember coming out and also just being, sort of shaken by what we had seen and understanding in some indirect way something of our loss, in that immense emotional depth of family that had gone for us, that has somehow gone because, as Jhumpa said, the people have gone, coming back to India. My father's no longer here. And he also gave me so much. I have to say, sitting up on the rooftop in Delhi with him, listening to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and Iqbal Bano and Noor Jahan, all of which I put in this most recent book. So it's wonderful to be here and to speak to readers, because this book is linked to the stories of my grandparents and my parents. And I think a lot of readers are also remembering their family stories in the same way. We're all losing that landscape, and it seems to be vanishing so fast.
Right. This session has a quarter of a decade in its title, so I feel compelled to ask questions that kind of cover the passage of time for both of you and how it's changed, both you as women, as writers, and as creative practitioners. Both of you won two of the world's biggest book prizes around the same time, 6 years apart from each other. Jhumpa, you won the Pulitzer in 2000. Kiran, you won the Booker in 2006. What has fame meant for you? How has it changed you as a person, your writing, the people who surround you, perhaps the quality of resources available to you? I imagine it's a combination of factors, but what do you think has changed most profoundly? I'd love to ask that to both of you. Jhumpa, if you can go first.
Yeah, well, it's certainly literary recognition changes things for the writer. I think it depends on the person and what that recognition means to the person. In my case, it was my first book. It was very unexpected, deeply unexpected by my publishers, by the general public, and certainly most of all myself. And so I didn't really know how to react when this news came. I was sort of stunned and worried more than anything. I felt a lot of apprehension, and there were a lot of people who, some people just were happy that it was a happy thing, but others were immediately sort of, well, can she write another book? Maybe it was a fluke. These kinds of things, and I mean, this is the way it is, and so I just sort of accepted that this was happening, and then I kind of put it over there. I was so young. I was so young as a writer, most of all.
I want to say that both of you were very young when you received the prizes as well.
I was young. I was young in years, but I was young as a writer. It was my first book. It was a book of stories. It was a book published as a paperback original. There were really no expectations on this book. There was no book tour for the book. Literally, there was no book tour. It just came out, and eventually, they started sending me places and signing things. But in the beginning, it was really just a very kind of, just a discreet paperback original. Let's see if someone will go for this thing, kind of, And so, but I will say that the things that have happened, I think the most meaningful thing that happened as a result of the Pulitzer Prize was that my work was translated into many languages. And that is, to me, a much bigger honor than a particular prize. So the fact that translators around the world in languages I will never be able to read have sat and spent time with my words and brought them to readers in other languages is deeply meaningful, has been deeply meaningful to me. And along with that, I have enjoyed the enormous gift of being able to travel to some of those places. I think a lot of my adventure with Italy and Italian was inspired by those early invitations to festivals in parts of Italy because of one thing kind of leads to another. So that has been really gratifying. I'll just close though by saying that I think I still try when I'm writing, I really try to go back to the person I was long before any of this happened. Writing has always been a very private experience for me, and I realize, you agree to publish the book and part with it, and then it becomes a public thing, and the public can interact with it or not. But I cultivate that prior place still, because I think that's, for me personally, it's very important to feel invisible as a writer, right? And to feel the freedom of just sitting in the corner and observing the world.
Thank you for sharing. Kiran, I want to ask you the same question and also want to add to it that, there was a gap of 20 years between your second and your third novel, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, which is out right now. Do you think the big prize, do you think the Booker gave you the security to take 2 decades to write the book?
Maybe, I was trying to retreat to the same place that Jhumpa is speaking about, to enter into a really quiet place, and also to, I think, what is difficult, of course, it's an honor to win a prize, and it does open up the large world. That's the extraordinary thing, that you get to see places you would never have seen, and get to experience things you never would have. And perhaps also it, writing in general was a sort of magic door in that it allowed me to understand that I would not lose India, that I would be able to go back and forth, and it allowed me to write from another landscape, a landscape of Latin America, to explore that. So it's given me so much in that way. But of course, it's very hard to write when there are eyes on you, and there's a lot of, I don't know how people do it. And I think I was probably trying to exit that feeling of self-consciousness completely. And I live in a very quiet neighborhood. I live in New York, and I kind of exited the literary world as well. I think for many years I've been living very quietly. And it's been wonderful to live like that. It's really been fantastic. It's hard to put a book out in the world again, It was fantastic to be able to live within an artistic life completely.
I'll follow that up. You've been in all the recent interviews you've done, you've spoken about how solitude is essential to the literary life. You even said that loneliness can be looked at as an ethical choice. Tell us about how your relationship with solitude has evolved in this period. I'll keep coming back to quarter of a decade. Because
No, one simple thing is that one just grows older. That's what. Suddenly you come up, and the younger writers who you're supposed to, you're a mentor to them the way other people looked after us. And it's strange after 20 years to realize that I'm now in a place where I should be, helping the younger generation. Solitude and loneliness. So in some languages, there isn't a difference between those two words, they conjoin. And I was, in this book, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, I was looking at the more painful sides of loneliness and thinking of the divides and rifts in the world as a kind of loneliness, but also loneliness as sustenance, and loneliness as a sort of, exquisite artistic loneliness, which I think any writer or artist experiences. This is, you need to be alone. And this has always been true from when I was a student in Vermont, where I wrote my first stories in snowbound Vermont, rather like Sonia in my book, which was my first discovery, both of painful loneliness, of being away from home for the first time, and that drastic difference, which is the big difference between India and the Western world, where you're never physically alone. You may feel lonely and escape to your bookshelf, but actually just being physically alone. But it was also my first experience of artistic loneliness, and realizing how important it was to be alone in order to work.
So, this experience with artistic loneliness was a big shift for you in the last 2 decades, and I feel similarly for you, Jhumpa, your move to Rome and writing in Italian. You moved in 2012, 13. What advice would you give to your younger self? Was there something you would have done differently before you embarked on this project, or are you absolutely satisfied with how it all shaped up?
You mean the Italian project,
yes. When you moved to Rome and started writing in Italian, is there something you wish, some knowledge or experience you wish you were equipped with at the start of that journey?
I wasn't looking for knowledge or secure. I was looking to let things go. I was looking to find a new form of solitude, even linguistically. I was looking to sort of, create a new place for myself vis-a-vis language, and a new city, and to move into a territory in which, it's been very interesting over the past 10 years. This whole question of literary recognition and prizes. It's been clear that to do something like writing in a second language, and people then scratching their heads saying, well, is it really Italian, or is it a translation already because she used to write in English, and these kinds of things, it eliminates you from these sort of general boxes, which are the big containers of recognition. And that has been very interesting to me. to just be aware of how we still need to have very specific markers of what a book is, how it's been written. They're okay. Or you can say, well, this is a recognition for a translated book, which are very important, or a book, or an original book. But then once those categories begin to be troubled, if you will, you start to slip through the cracks, I think, in a really interesting way. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed being able to step away from the entire mechanism of how, and not only, not simply prizes and recognitions, but also just sort of how to classify, how to put me into a syllabus, or how to teach the work, how to sell the book, where to put it in the bookstore. All of these have been really eye-opening to me. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question of what I would do differently. I think part of the point of it was to stumble, to feel vulnerable, to be lost, to find my way again, and to find something new about myself. And that I did, thanks to the Italian language and to my sort of experience of also being in the place and remaking my life midway, right? Midway through the journey. I hope midway through the journey.
We hope so too. Kiran, in my reading of Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, I feel you've pulled away the veil between lived experience and fiction so much in the book. I feel authors are often quite terrified of readers finding biographical details in their novels, often irritated when interviewers ask them, was this based on your life? And Jhumpa, you too, in your the first book in Italian, when you wrote In Other Words, you're so vulnerable about your own, as you say, you're kind of falling into Italy, falling into the Italian language, and it's so bare and raw, so to speak. Do you think that is a confidence that you've gained over time of putting your lived experience more in your fiction, more than the first two books?
I wasn't thinking of that, to be honest, Anindita. I was really wanting to capture the India of my grandparents and my parents, which I thought this was my one midway through life. I knew that I was going to lose this subject, and it remains a precious subject to me because these figures seemed so larger than life. They had constantly thinking about the parallels between my journey and the journey of my grandparents, which was so much more dramatic, and curious about the parallels and the echoes and the emotional parallels between, and curious about India's relationship with the Western world through several generations. And so I very deliberately was drawing on those landscapes, although they are, I would say that they are fictionalized. Nobody is exactly the way they are. But I did go back to that landscape of the veranda in Allahabad where my grandparents would sit out every morning and at dawn argue very vociferously about what the meals would be for the rest of the day. And I wanted to, a novel can work by preserving certain things that remain worth preserving, especially when you think of how quickly the past is vanishing and how much India is changing. I wanted to hold on to that.
Thank you. Jhumpa, I want to ask about how early influences shaped you. You've spoken about how I think your mother read out Ashapurna Devi stories to you, and there might be Ashapurna Devi readers in the audience. You didn't read Bangla, so she read out the stories to you, and then you wrote one of your papers on it. And at the start of this conversation, you spoke about the varied artistic and creative influences that your Calcutta family had on you. Could you speak a bit about how all those literary influences growing up influenced your writing later?
I think that it was very interesting that because there was a divide, regardless, in terms of language. You know, my mother was a passionate reader. She would come to Kolkata. She would, you know, haul back books from College Street and so on. I couldn't read any of them with facility. And on the other side, I became a reader. I learned how to read in the English language as a young girl, and soon after reading, I began writing, you know, little stories and this, that. And I was always very aware of the fact that the passion that she had as a reader, as a writer, as she was a poet, was different, that there was a barrier between what she was experiencing and thinking about and what I was. And I was, and you know, on this topic of sort of solitude and loneliness, I think part of my development as a human being, as a reader, I mean, because it was all happening in English, it felt sort of doubly isolating, because I knew that my mother, my father was not really a reader, is not really a reader of literature, shall we say. I mean, reads other things, newspapers. But I was very keenly aware of this separation, and I also felt that it was through reading works in English, and mostly I was reading kind of, you know, Western authors, what have you, children's books, things that were available in the local library, the school library where I was raised in Rhode Island. I was aware that this reading, this experience of reading, which was so important to me, so crucial to me as a way of coping with my own loneliness and confusion as a child, was a way of giving me an access, a direct access into Western ways and customs that my parents didn't have. So in a strange way, the whole project of becoming a reader, which was the entire basis of becoming a writer, was, I felt that I was sort of almost betraying my parents in a way, you know, and there was always the conflict anyway, which I talked about last time I was up on the stage a few days ago, about sort of this generational difference, and in my case, very pronounced difference between the formation of my mother and father in this city, their education, their language, their tests, their, you know, the books, the poets, the things they had to learn to become educated, and what I was being taught. And so I was just very aware of this all the time. I think by the time I got, you know, became a graduate student, and I was trying to sort of knit together these two sides of myself, these what felt like two very disparate sides of myself. So the translation project of Ashapurna Devi was really quite lovely. And what happened was, you know, back then we didn't have phones that recorded. We had actual tape recorders with tapes, you know, cassettes, and I would stick one in. I would go back to their house, my parents' house, and I would hit record, and my mother would read the Bangla version, and I would record it, and then I would go back to Boston where I was living, and I had the books too, and I could read Bangla. I had been taught how to read it, just very slowly and not perfectly at all, far from perfect. But I could, you know, I could piece together things. And I remember I would go back and I would listen and play back, and I was following along the text. And sometimes I would realize, oh my God, my mother left out this whole paragraph. And I would call her and I would say, Ma, did you leave? Oh, hi. You know, I just took it to short kore dilam. And so I kind of like caught her. It was very sweet. I don't know where those tapes went. I would like to find them because her voice is there, of course. And so these things, these projects were ways of trying to, as I said, place her influences, the font of her influences, and what I was doing as a writer, as an emerging writer, as a translator. You know, I learned a lot about writing through the act of translation. I still learn a lot about writing through my work as a translator. I've been devoting quite a bit of energy and time to translation, especially in the past decade or 12 years, not only from Italian, but now with Latin, and I've been translating Ovid's Metamorphoses for the past 5 years. So anyway, all of these things are ways to make sense of of life, I suppose.
Kiran, it can't be easy to be Anita Desai's daughter, but it also means that you inherited, you said, a vast library. And she was also a professor of, okay, the birds have some questions. She was also a professor of English literature, and she introduced you and your siblings to a lot of Indian writers in English earlier than perhaps your counterparts would have been introduced to them. So who were the early, Indian writers that you read, and when did you decide to become a writer?
So lovely to, thank you for the question. It's so lovely to hear Jhumpa talk about all of this, because it's so interesting to hear what writers, what their reading, childhood reading was, where they're coming from. I'll talk about my mother's bookshelf, because her first language was German. Isn't that strange? Growing up in Old Delhi. Father was Bengali, but he had spent so much time in Germany doing his PhD. And then, of course, they both lost their landscapes. One lost, it's now Bangladesh. One never went back to Germany. And they found a new home in Delhi. And then the languages, they also must have spoken Hindi, of course, and English. And it was interesting, Jhumpa mentioned Somerset Maugham, because my mother said her mother loved to read Somerset Maugham. And of course, the bookshelves were full of English books, full of books which we would get from the British Council, all the bookshops in Delhi that we would go to one after the other, which I all remember, because each one is so different, because the owners of those bookshops, each one had such a personality. And I remember, all of those different ones, the ones where you couldn't unwrap a book because the man would come down and scream it, they were all wrapped in plastic. I remember a bookshop owned by Maneka Gandhi, of all, the one time in her life. But they were all a lot of British literature, American as well, and lots of works in translation. It was a very international bookshelf. But I remember, the shock of leaving India and going to England when I was 16, and I was there for 1 year, but it was a very crucial year of passing the O-level exam, so it was the high school time. And the shock of the division between that bookshelf and what I was actually seeing in England. And nobody had sort of told me. We were living in Delhi, and my mother was, wrote in a very isolated way. There wasn't a lot of companionship for her. But again, this magic door had opened, and there would be publishers coming from overseas, and they would stay with us in Delhi. And they all had tummy upsets. And I remember we used to give them tuna fish on toast. And they would stay with us for a while, and glamorous translators would arrive. And then, of course, we left through that same door. But it was a very disconcerting experience for me. For her, it was sort of, I think, going to a publishing landscape that she knew already and where she felt her work was appreciated. But I was in school, and I think I felt the same dislocation and the shock of, one book that became important to me eventually was Naipaul's Enigma of Arrival, because I felt that shock of journeying to where we had mistakenly assigned a sort of center, and then finding it didn't really exist. So that was an important realization.
You spoke about your mother's lack of companionship. I was wondering, was it because she was a woman writer and everybody else was, there were fewer women writers at the time?
No, she was, she had 4 children. She was living in, at that time, there were not so many writers writing in English. And there were vibrant literary centers in India and other languages. But in English, the writers were sort of scattered. I think there was R.K. Narayan and a few others, of course, Mulkraj, Anand, people like that. But they didn't meet very often. So I think she's quite startled to see my life in comparison. But you're right, we had Indian literature in translation, and The other day, I was just thinking about how I would not know my own country were it not for translators. You know, you would just be, my language was English, and they would just have been that one little world were it not for translations.
I want to ask you both about how you react to how your books are received. As debut novelists, we do read reviews, and it often makes us very sad or happy. But when you speak to other writers, people claim they don't read reviews or they have someone screening reviews. Has your response to reviews, both good or bad, changed over time? You know, or do you read all of them? Did you read all of them? Did you have someone you trust screen them for you? I want to ask you, Jhumpa.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, in the beginning, of course, you write a book and you can't believe someone wants to even publish it. So that's already kind of surreal situation. And then you get the book and you realize it's become a book. And then a review comes out and the publicist calls and says, so-and-so reviewed the book. And so of course, in the beginning, it was all like going through the, looking glass, and I would cut them out, I mean, it just seemed, I couldn't believe this was happening to me. It was almost like it was as this other person had become the published writer, and I was sort of this ghost person who was following what was happening to her. But then, of course, sometimes I'm thinking of interpretive maladies. There was a mean review. I remember there was a mean review. And I remember going to my husband's office. He worked at Time magazine at the time, and just weeping on the couch and feeling so hurt that someone had said mean things about my book. And then I realized that, publishing a book meant anyone could say anything they wanted, and they could be very kind, and they could be very cruel, and they could be something in between, or they could not review it at all, which is, sort of made the ultimate. So then I did, I think just to protect my equilibrium and to keep in that space of not having the eyes on you. My husband he's somewhere around here, he would read them first, and then I think there was even a point where I wasn't allowed to open the New York Times.
You made the rule yourself.
No, he did it. And then I just stopped reading the reviews. I stopped reading the reviews, and I certainly stopped reading them in the moment that the book was coming out. Because I think the moment the books were coming out in the beginning was this is back when I really participated in promotion of a book. I mean, in recent years, my participation level when the books come out has really dropped, and I don't do very much promotion. But back then, I did more, and so it was you feel so many, you feel so vulnerable when the book comes out. So I certainly, I would ask the editors to sort of hold everything, and then maybe, when it was all over and I wasn't exhausted from going here and there, I could sort of look at them or look at a selection of them. The review culture has really changed since that book came out. Good reviewers of books are few and far between.
Do you still weep, though, if you see a very bad review in a reputable publication?
I would. Of course I would. And I've wept when people have said cruel things about me in other ways. I mean, I'm a human being. And nobody likes to hear someone being taken, no one likes to feel taken down in a public way. So I think the minute you decide to, I don't have social media, I don't participate in those things, but I think even, I think what happens now is people will see something about you, whether it's, good, bad, medium, and they'll just forward it to you. They'll say, oh, hey, so I just saw so-and-so said something about you, here it is. And because we have these horrible telephones that, and it's like, there's no filter anymore. You can just be sort of walking down the street or whatever, and then you click, and then you realize, and this has happened to me, So I have to be honest. I don't feel. I mean, I think it's so interesting that people are cruel to writers. I mean, can I just say this? I mean, we really we're just thinking something and sort of trying it out, and you don't have to read the book if you don't want to. Like, we're not forcing you to read it, and but the review, the whole dimension of the and I understand the importance of critical reception and exchange, and I actually mourn the decline of a real review culture in our world at this point. But I think I think that's been replaced by people are very quick to point a finger and to sort of be mean. Anyway, I mean, this is not a plea for everyone to be nice, but to us. But I think, I mean, I can't imagine. I suppose I guess what I'm trying to say is I can't imagine being mean to another artist, because all artists are. I mean, we have to be a family, and we don't have to have the exact same taste for every single book by every single person. But I feel. Maybe I'm just very idealistic, but I feel like a kind of camaraderie and solidarity with my fellow writers that I think is especially important in terms of, when you're representing experiences, voices, a world, in the Anglosphere, for example, like, sort of what has come out of this entire part of the world. I mean, to me, it's very important to be united, not be divided.
To that point, sometimes reviewers also tag the writer in a negative review because they want you to read it, and if you don't amplify it, then you're not a sport. So with social media, I think what you're talking about has kind of exponentially grown, the directness of that coming to you.
I don't even know what a tag is.
On Twitter, so if you had a Twitter handle or an Instagram handle, they would do @Jhumpa Lahiri. So it would actually just come to you.
Would it?
Yeah, it would come to you. You would see it. And they want you to see it. They think that you deserve to see it. But Kiran, you're right, and this is the last question before we open it up to the audience. You're right in the middle of all of this that Jhumpa is speaking about right now. You're doing the tours. I don't know if you're reading the reviews, but as someone who's been in solitude for 20 years, writing the book, how has it been to kind of step out now with your book in the world? And you've been really a champion for your book, in the sense you've really done the book tour, like you still have a few weeks to go. How has that been for you, and how do you protect the solitude of Kiran Desai in this whole book festival season?
Well, I felt as if I owed it to my publishers. I had to, because I hadn't published in so long, that I would have to be out in the world a little bit. Which what Jhumpa is saying is so correct. I think you cease to be a human being for so many people, so they feel they can just say anything they please. There's just a feeling that you're out there and that you're somehow not a person anymore. And you should be able to take whatever they throw at you. And the cruelty is quite fascinating, really. And you, again, wonder, why it would bother someone, why an author of all people would manage to excite such emotion. So you have to protect yourself. And also, you're a writer.
How do you do that?
There's not...
How do you protect yourself?
A lot that you can, you are especially vulnerable, I think, as a writer, that there's really nothing between you and what's coming at you. And I live alone and I work alone, so if I were to just read something horrible, I would just be by myself dealing with it, And that is, and of course, there's always a bad review, right? At least several bad reviews, just like that there are always a few mosquitoes. There's always one vicious mosquito. I was thinking that in the car over today. So you're going to get it, and it is going to be awful. It's going to be somebody who's really seems more, it's not even a review, right? It just seems pure vicious attack for it's disdainful, it's disrespectful, and it's thoroughly nasty. And that, I think there are people who take pleasure in doing this sort of thing. And then you do have to also wonder who these people are who are writing reviews and what their qualifications are meanwhile. And often then none. You know, because you don't get a degree for being a reviewer. Sometimes they're a professor of literature or something like that, but quite often there's nothing at all other than that they've just started reviewing and they're known as a reviewer and your book gets sent to them. Or they don't know anything about the landscape you're writing about. It's completely mystifying to them. Or there's some other grudge going on. But what I do is, I mean, I try not to read reviews. I try not to read reviews, or I read them in a very haphazard way. I mean, you know, if something pops up here and there, but I certainly don't sit down and read all the reviews consistently across the board. I don't do that to myself.
Thank you to the two of you for, being so vulnerable and open and sharing with the audience. I'm sure there are writers, young writers out there and debut writers who'll feel much better knowing that Jhumpa Lahiri too cried on reading a bad review. I'm going to take 4 questions, but please keep them focused and direct them to either Jhumpa or to Kiran, not to both of them. Yes, second row. Is somebody passing a mic along?
Thank you very much. My question to Jhumpa. We have seen this Indian writer, most of the time they're writing, people from Indian diaspora, they're writing on Indian subject, most of the time, okay? So have you ever think to write on entirely Western subject where you are living and all the character, they belong to that particular society? Thank you.
Well, I have done that. And I mean, in the recent work that I've written in Italian, I've actually taken away the specifics of identity. So one is not able to, pinpoint whether the character is a so-called native of the place or a so-called foreigner to the place, but they certainly are not, there's nothing traceable to India or to Indians in that work, in those works. From the beginning, my work has been, from the very first book, the stories have combined characters from different backgrounds and ethnic and national identities, and if you will. So there are American characters and English characters and Italian characters and characters who are born and bred in India, characters who are, born and raised by Indian parents outside of India. So, the answer to your question is I feel that I've been doing that from the very beginning.
We're short on time, so I'm going to take one question for Kiran. Which of you has a question for Kiran? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. In your novel, we have seen the characters dealing with silence more than direct speech. But we are living in 2026 and there is a social media going on. There's a constant narration of the self. Every day we are narrating what we are doing every day. But in your novel, the characters are more dealing with silence and they are confronting the silence in themselves. They're isolating themselves. So how do you see, is silence a resistance in modern literature today?
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing, that the book is also a little bit set in the past, right? Set in the late 1990s and early 2000s, before cell phones and social media. And they were the first computers. I'm covering the time when those first old word processors were around. But to talk about solitude in general in the modern world, or loneliness in the modern world, I think what is fascinating to me is that the more noisy it is and the more crowded our planet is, and the more people there are, somehow it is strange how more alone we all still feel. We're feeling more alone the more crowded the planet is. So in part, the book was an exploration of that feeling. Why is it? Why is that so?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for your lovely question. I could sit here talking to Jhumpa and Kiran for an hour more, and I'm sure the audience would stay back and skip dinner for it. But we do have to wrap up. Kiran has already done her signings. Jhumpa will be signing copies at the signing station after this. Thank you for being a lovely audience.
Thank you so much. Thank
And
you.
thank you, Jhumpa and Kiran. Thank
Lovely
you.
Evening.
More signing by Kiran needed.